For Module 2, we're discussing informational interviews, and as part of your informational interview assignment, you are expected to give a formal business presentation highlighting what you've learned through your informational interviews. Throughout the semester, you'll be giving business presentations in class as well. And so the information I'm sharing in this lecture just needs to be fresh on your minds this semester because you'll be graded on knowing and utilizing these tips when you speak. And I also want to stress that these tips are something that you could really apply to any presentation in any workplace setting or in any class, unless the professor specifies a different format. This is always one you can fall back on that is really basic and very impressive. So now what I want to talk to you first about is just planning the presentation. The first issue with planning the presentation is you really do need to just look at what is the purpose for the presentation. In the business setting, typically there are three main purposes. Those include reporting, explaining, or updating. Another consideration is the timing of the presentation. This could involve a variety of factors, such as how long do you have for the presentation? I typically specify an amount of time that you'll have in my class for your presentations. Your informational interview presentation, for instance, is 8 to 10 minutes. It's important that you make a note of times that you are given for any presentation that you give, because you want to make sure that you're able to get to the point of your presentation within the allotted time frame. If you're in a meeting and you've been told you have 5 to 6 minutes to present and you don't time it as you prepare, you may likely run overtime, and therefore your presentation might be tabled for the next meeting, and you'll just be very frustrated because you weren't able to get to your point. So make sure you pay close attention to time. Also, you may want to think about what time of day you're presenting. Many times you will be told, or it will be specified, what time of day you're presenting. But if you're not given a time of day and it's left up to you, if your supervisor comes to you and says, when would you like to present? Research has shown that mid-morning, around 10 o'clock, is the best time to present, because that's when people are the most alert. Too early in the morning, they're still sleepy. At noon, they're hungry. After lunch, they just want to lay down and take a nap, and then closer to 3 or 4 o'clock, they're thinking about the day ending. So 10 o'clock would be the ideal time if you have a choice. Next, we're going to look at audience analysis. This is another important consideration as you prepare your presentations. There are three areas I'd like to touch on. Demographical analysis. Well, if you look at what demographics means, demographics is defined as audience characteristics. So here we're looking at gender, age, socioeconomic status, political orientation, all different things like that. So demographics comes into play. You would want to know if you're speaking to a group of 10-year-olds versus college students versus elderly, because that would certainly affect the language that you use. Maybe even you'd be more animated with the younger audience of 10-year-olds. So demographics is important to keep in mind. Also, we have a psychological analysis. With a psychological analysis, this is just getting inside the minds of your listeners, so you can try to understand their hidden agendas or biases. And so in our class, as far as a psychological analysis, we don't conduct a formal psychological analysis, which would be a good example of this would be a survey to tap your audience's biases or predispositions. The problem with a survey is it typically takes too much time. However, we do conduct psychological analyses on a more informal level in our class because, for instance, through the mission, vision, values, and goals presentations, we shared very personal aspects about ourselves, and also through group work that we take part in business communication class. You learn a lot about each other through that process. Situational analysis is looking at where you're speaking and the number of people in the audience. When I used to teach at San Diego State University, the dean always asked me to present on National City Junior High Day. And I remember the first time she asked me to present, I asked how many people would be in the audience, because I knew in my classroom I maybe had about 3 extra chairs. And she said, "No, Kim, you won't be presenting in your classroom. You'll be presenting in, so-and-so lecture hall." So I can remember going to the lecture hall and seeing that it housed about or seated about 200 to 300 people. And so I followed up with her and said, "Exactly how many people will be visiting my class that day?" And she said 100 students, in addition to my class of 21 or 22 students. So in preparation for that day and doing a situational analysis, I actually not only visited this lecture hall where I would be presenting, I actually gave a sample lecture, brought a friend along who sat in the back row and asked, "Can you hear me? I needed to assess if I would need a microphone or not. Also, could my print be visible if I had a PowerPoint? How large would I need to make it so that people in the back row could view it?" So all these different considerations I had when doing this situational analysis. And so for you, it's important that you know where it is that you'll be presenting, and if possible, go to that actual place and practice your presentation. That is really the best way to prepare. All right, next we're going to look at different delivery methods, and research shows that there are 4 basic delivery methods. Impromptu speaking is speaking with little or no preparation. It might be like you in a business meeting being called upon to give a quick update on a project that you've been working on. You didn't know you were going to be asked to give the update, but you go about it very quickly in 1 or 2 minutes and give an update. That's, once again, speaking with little or no preparation. Memorizing, you don't often hear recommended in the business communication field. Why? Well, because if you forget a word, many times it's hard to go on. And so I would only recommend someone memorize a part of their presentation if it is short and sweet and somebody says it better than you can say it. Then it would be okay to memorize that, but you do run a risk of forgetting, and then it is difficult to pick up where you left off. Reading, you don't see very often in the business setting as well in terms of a delivery method. A time when you might see reading happening is if you are proofing something, and so you are reading every single word. When every single word is important, that's when you would use this delivery method, but you really don't see it very much. Plus, you will lose your listeners if you're reading everything word for word. So what are we striving for in presentations? Well, speaking from notes, keywords, so it's prepared, but you have note cards with keywords or just keywords up on your PowerPoint, and that is known as extemporaneous speaking. It's conversational in nature. It helps you capture your audience's attention and maintain their attention and interest. And so that's what we're striving for. So today I'm going to talk about how we go about speaking in this manner. Now we're going to move on to organizing the presentation, and once again this is just a basic format that you can really use for almost any presentation. I have a friend that teaches at USC in the Marshall School of Business, and he said, "Kim, you know what?" He said, "CEOs of companies don't know how to use this basic format." And so he actually does consulting with different owners of companies on this basic format. Because many times they assume people know the background information, and they present information that's just above everyone's heads. So these are the different parts of a formal presentation, and once again you can apply these outside of the classroom, and I encourage you to do that. First of all is to have an opening with some sort of attention getter. This could be a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question is when you pose a question to the audience and ask them just to think about the question. It could be a startling statistic. It could also be a startling quote. Those are just a few. Preview of main points. What are the points you're talking about in the body of your presentation? This helps set up the presentation for your listeners so they know what's to come. Now, these are the 2 points that are important to include as part of an opening or an introduction. The body of the presentation, you'll want to choose a logical sequence. If there is no order, it's called topical sequence. It's just listed by topic. If there is a specified order, something logically comes first, second, and third, then you'd use a chronological format. All right? And so you want to be aware direct and indirect formats. Direct is, think of it this way. You're direct and to the point. So you start right out with, let's say, your recommendation, and then you support that recommendation with pieces of evidence. Indirect is when you start with pieces of evidence leading up to your recommendation. So I always tell students, if an audience is with you from the beginning and you know that, let's say you are proposing a new logo for your company, and you've already shown the people that are attending the meeting the logo, maybe one-on-one with each person, and they all love it and they're ready for a change, you could probably use a direct approach. However, if you know there's some controversy over your logo, you know there will be some opposition, or you have a good idea there will be, then you would use an indirect approach and talk about the need for a new logo and the problems with the current logo. All right, so that's indirect. So know those 3 types of organizational sequences. All right, use transitions between main points. In a presentation, your main points would fall at this level, 1, 2, and 3, and then you would have subpoints. Between the main points, though, you would have transitions. Now that I've talked about this, I will now move on to talk about this, my next point. So it's clear to the listener that you're transitioning from one point to another. 3, establish credibility. All right, how do we do this? All right, how do we do this? Well, first of all, let's define credibility. Credibility is defined as believability, that you're knowledgeable. So in what ways do we show that we are credible or knowledgeable when it comes to giving a presentation? Think about that for a moment. Well, if you think about it, many times credibility starts from the moment you walk in the door. And so remember the statement I gave you when we talked about nonverbal communication, light travels faster than sound. So you're seen before you're heard. So dressing professionally gets you off on the right foot. So that helps establish credibility. Yes, you can hurt your credibility by what you say and do throughout your presentation, but appearance does play a role in credibility, especially when it comes to first impressions. All right, other ways to establish credibility would be citing your sources. That, pointing out that your presentation and the views expressed in your presentation are not just all your opinion. You have evidence to support it, and you cite the sources of that evidence. All right. Also, establishing credibility deals with making eye contact. Someone who reads word for word their presentation will look much less knowledgeable than somebody who's looking out at the audience. Right, and that's why it's so important just to put keywords on your note cards. I always say, though, you could have a couple quotes in your presentation and write those out word for word on your note cards, but set us up for those quotes. Most of your presentation should be very conversational and have just keywords that you're then explaining in more detail verbally. So eye contact, also posture, standing tall, all of these things play into your credibility. Even citing your background on the subject, your experience with the subject, establishes credibility. Okay, lastly, with this presentation format, we have our conclusion. Simply summarize the main points that you touched on. In this presentation, I discussed blank, blank, and blank, and then creatively tie back to whatever you started with. If you started with a quote, repeat part of that quote, and just creatively tie back to what you started with. Maybe talk about how now we view this quote in the new light, or we might reflect on this quote based on the information you've shared. Okay, developing visual aids, whether it be a poster, a DVD, a skit or a role play, or a PowerPoint presentation, you want to make sure that your visual aids help your credibility and not hurt your credibility. So let's look at a few pointers. First of all, with PowerPoint presentations, what you'll want to make sure that you have is a large font size. 27 to 40 point font size is the recommended font size for a PowerPoint. This is 27, so you can see the font size I'm using is a little bit larger than 27. Here's 40 point, just to give you a sense. And then utilize an outline format with keywords or phrases that I've already mentioned, right? Because you want to be conversational. Every time through your presentation, it should be a little bit different wording, but you're still covering the same key points, right? But you have not memorized it. Have information appear as you cover it, just as I have information coming up point by point during this PowerPoint. Why do you have it come up point by point rather than putting it all up at once? Well, you probably guessed it. You don't want the audience reading ahead. All right, I'm up on point 1, but you're down on point 3. All right, because I put everything up at once. You want to be able to make sure your audience is following you along. They're with you on the point that you're on. So I recommend that PowerPoints come up point by point for that reason. Next, backgrounds, PowerPoint backgrounds. Use professional or conservative backgrounds. There's a lot out there in terms of backgrounds, but remember, in a business setting, for the most part, you want to err on the conservative side. Yes, of course, I know that depends on the business, but overall, when in doubt, err on the conservative side. All right. I have seen backgrounds that are clouds, blue sky with white clouds, and the default color was white in PowerPoint. So students, whenever their lettering fell on a cloud, we couldn't read it. So I mean, just use common sense. Go in, change that color to something that will stand out. Use creative supporting graphics. I think it's nice to have a graphic that complements your text. If not on every slide, at least every other slide. Okay, but once again, keep it professional. The graphic shouldn't distract your listeners. It should clearly support what you're saying. And avoid sound effects in a professional presentation. I had a student once who, when he presented, every time he moved to a new line, we'd hear a car screeching to a halt. He had the sound on a timer that whenever he clicked to go to a new line, we'd hear this car screeching to a halt. And at the end of his face turned a little red right at first when it happened, and by the end of the presentation, he was just like, oh, why did I do that? And he came up to me and said, that sounded so cool when I was preparing it at home, but when I get in front of a group and I'm dressed professionally, it doesn't seem very professional. So I just wanted to share that with you. I would avoid sound effects in your presentation. Posters or flip charts? Well, you don't see this quite as often now that we have the technology with PowerPoint and so forth, but there may be a time when you do want to use a poster or flip chart just to break things up a bit. Use 1-inch lettering. I would even recommend using stencils. Okay, you can buy the little stick-on letters and do that. Also, contrasting paper and print. Same thing, same concept that I just talked about with PowerPoint, using a background, using lettering that stands out against your background. Keep it simple. You don't want to have 3 charts on one slide or on one poster board. You want 1 chart per poster board or per slide, and enlarge it so everything is visible. So an important tip, the quality of your visual aid influences your credibility. All right, so important. So put time into your visual aids so they help your credibility and they don't hurt it. For a skit, you might be wondering, when would you be using a skit? Well, sometimes students will role play their attention getter. And I think it's a really effective way to get a point across. But you want to make sure that if you are having some sort of a skit in your presentation, that you work with the people who are involved in it, that you prep them, you go through it a few times, you give them your expectations for it, because you want to make sure that it is professional in nature. If you plan to use a video clip, I always recommend, especially if you're embedding it into your PowerPoint, that you practice in the setting where you're presenting, because sometimes those video clips just don't go as planned. And so I think it's so important that you practice and make sure your video is working, that volume is turned up, because I would say 80% of the presentations I've watched that include video, it doesn't go as planned. So definitely make sure you check it out before the big day, before your presentation, and keep it short, 1 to 2 minutes. And once again, make sure that that clip pertains to the presentation and that you can make that connection. And then most of all, practice, practice, practice. I can always tell presenters who have gone through it several times, they seem like they know what they're doing. It just flows smoothly. So it's very obvious when people have practiced and when they have not. Now we go to delivering the presentation, stage fright. I want to talk about stage fright a little bit here because many students view this as such a negative thing, and it doesn't have to be. I want to define it first of all. This is the normal anxiety that occurs before a presentation and dissipates as the presentation progresses. So no, that's not a baby in that person's stomach. That's actually a butterfly, supposed to symbolize butterflies in the stomach. I actually tell students that having a little bit of anxiety is a good thing because it shows you care. All right, I worry more about the student who shows up and they're not nervous at all on a big day of a presentation. I worry more about them, because if you care, you're going to be a little bit excited, a little bit anxious. And so it's normal, and it typically goes away as the presentation progresses. A study was conducted by 2 individuals, last names Brownell and Catula, and they looked at anxiety and levels of anxiety before a presentation, when you're in your seat, before the presentation, during the intro, during the body, and during the Q&A. They found that anxiety levels were highest when you're in your seat and then during your introduction. So during your seat, during the introduction, if you can get through those 2 time periods, typically anxiety drops during the body and then the conclusion. So symptoms, what are some of the symptoms we have? Well, physical symptoms, we have both physical and mental symptoms. Physical symptoms could be anything like sweating, shaking. Honestly, you're not normal if you don't shake a little bit when you're up presenting. Something very normal for speakers to see them shake a little bit. Sweating, heart pounding. Mental, sending yourself negative messages, the negative what ifs, what if this happens, what if that happens. Try to focus in on your message more than anything. One thing that I always found helpful was try to imagine your worst fear actually happening and see yourself getting through it. Once you've done that, once you've accepted your worst fear and seen yourself getting through it, it will no longer be a fear, because you've in a sense invited it on. And I know that may sound strange, but it is true. Once you've accepted it, that it could happen and you would be okay, it will no longer be a fear. All right, so common nervous habits, I've mentioned a few, but verbal clutter, the ums and the uhs that you hear, and all right, rocking back and forth, increasing your rate. It's not uncommon for you to time a presentation at home when you're relaxed and you're at 8 minutes and you get up in front of the group and you're at 6 minutes and you wonder what happened, right? Increasing rate is very common. And then sweating and heart pounding. All right, if you have any of these things that are noticeable, like the ums and the likes, or the rocking back and forth, or so forth, I'll try to make a note to you so you can work on, for those that you can work on, you're aware of them and you can work on them before the next presentation. So ways to alleviate: first and foremost, pick a topic that you're interested in. It really does show when you're passionate about your subject. Secondly, accept your worst fear and realize it's okay and it will no longer occupy your thoughts, and that's something we just talked about. Take deep breaths. All right, you'll look sillier trying to get every word out as quickly as possible than if you just gather your thoughts, stop, take a deep breath, and then go on. Okay? Actually being comfortable with the silence shows skill as a speaker. So don't worry about those moments of silence when you're taking a deep breath and gathering your thoughts. And lastly, practice, practice, practice. It really is the key. You're still, obviously if you care, you're still going to be a little bit anxious and nervous, but having practiced gives you that confidence going in to your presentation, just knowing that you've gone through it many times and you've done well. Okay, you've gone through it, you can get through it, you're familiar with it. Aspects of delivery that we're looking at: eye contact, which we talked about, that enhances credibility; movement, gestures, and walking, which should happen when? We talked about this earlier in the semester, but on or near transitions. Okay, that's when you want to be at least making full body movements to one side of the room or the other. And gestures, you should just always free up a hand so that you can gesture. Once again, we're striving for extemporaneous speaking, which is conversational in nature. And we just naturally gesture when we speak. Vocal variation, volume, and rate truly adds energy and life to your presentation. If you are monotone and you speak in the same tone the entire time, you will lose your audience. So you want to have that vocal variation and increase your volume and speak at an understandable rate. Appearance, once again, dressing formally gets you off on the right foot. And then, of course, what you say and do in the presentation can further enhance your credibility or hurt your credibility. And once again, I can't say it enough, practice, practice, practice. It's the key to a smooth presentation. All right. Thank you.